Is Ontario still a democracy? Community leaders sound the alarm. Welcome to Regent Park TV. I'm Sam. Today, we bring you an important conversation where community leaders, legal experts, and elected officials gathered to tackle a critical question: is Ontario's democracy being weakened? The panel, hosted by NDP MPP Chris Glover and moderated by MPP Jessica Bell, brought together voices ranging from Indigenous activists to education organizers and academic experts. More than 100 people attended the event, which included a Q&A and comments from participants, bringing community voices and lived experiences into discussion. Panelists broke down how major decisions about Ontario's public lands, public services, and billions of public dollars are now happening with less transparency and less community oversight. Panelists warned that these changes erode democratic rights and concentrate power in ways that affect every neighborhood. When democratic oversight weakens, communities like ours often feel the impact first. With that in mind, let's take a closer look at the event and hear directly from the speakers who are sounding the alarm and pushing for change.
This tonight is he introduced strong mayor powers. And so strong mayor powers means that we no longer have majority vote democracy in most of our cities and towns. That the mayor and a third of city councillors can overrule 2/3 of city councillors. So that's another democratic right that we're losing. He's just removed, and we've got Katrina here on the panel, who's going to be talking about the removal of our school board trustees. You know, and that was our original in Ontario and before in Upper Canada. The first experience of people, after First Nations people, of the settler communities of democracy was electing school board trustees starting with the Education Act in 1816. So, you know, they are bringing to an end 209-year-old practice of democracy. The other one is justice. Somebody mentioned justice. And one of the things about justice is that you have to have, it's coming on and off? Okay, it's back. The rule of law. And we've got, what the government has done here, the Ford Conservatives, they passed legislation that allows them, it started with Ontario Place. They passed the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act, and they said that this project is exempt from any provincial or municipal law. We can break any provincial or municipal law at Ontario Place. And then when they got away with that, they introduced Bill 5, and Bill 5 says we can declare, the Ford government can declare any part of the province a special economic zone, and in that special economic zone, they can break any provincial or municipal law. So we no longer have a system of justice. We no longer have equal application of the law because cabinet ministers can choose who the laws apply to and who they don't apply to. So there's no longer, you know, equal application of the law, which is a fundamental principle of our democracy. Let's see, nobody mentioned this, but freedom of speech. Raise your hand if you think freedom of speech is an inviolable part of democratic rights. Okay, I think everybody's raised their hand. So the other thing this government has done is they've introduced 3 bills in the legislature that use the notwithstanding clause. And the notwithstanding clause, it's a euphemism. It's a section of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that allows any provincial or federal government to override our fundamental freedoms and legal rights under the Charter. And the fundamental freedoms are things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. The legal rights that they can also override are things like, if you are arrested, you have to be charged with a crime. You have a right to a lawyer without delay. They've passed two and introduced 3 pieces of legislation that specifically override our rights, Ontarians' rights to those fundamental freedoms and legal rights. So it's really, when I ask the question, you know, is Ontario still a democracy? I would say it's not anymore. We need to restore our democracy in this province. And that's what this panel discussion is about. This is about raising awareness of where we've come to and starting to build a movement to restore democracy in Ontario. And I'm going to pass it on because we've got an incredible panel, a group of panelists here to talk about different aspects of how they are each fighting to restore a different aspect of our democratic rights in Ontario.
Sanford Barnes is a professor of public management emeritus at the University of Toronto, where he taught from 1990 until his retirement in 2020. He was the founding chair of the Department of Management at the University of Toronto at Scarborough. He is the author and co-author of 11 books and 80 articles. His most recent book, Public Representations, Analyses, Contemporary Films and Streaming Series about politics in the US, UK and Canada, and it will be published by the University of Toronto Press in April 2026. And earlier this year he received the King Charles III Coronation Medal. And the questions we have for Sanford are a little bit different because your background is you've got the historical perspective. So Sanford, our questions to you are how has Premier Ford affected the university sector, which is where you are? And also, you talked a little bit about democratic backsliding. Can you tell us a little bit about democratic backsliding and what else is going on in other countries in just 3 short minutes?
Okay. When I was asked to be on the panel, I asked myself, what is an area of scholarship that would be relevant to the questions we're discussing? It turns out there is an area of scholarship that's very relevant. It's called the study of democratic backsliding, or how democratic governments become authoritarian. Two books in the area that I'll mention. First, Timothy Snyder on tyranny. Snyder was at Yale and came to the University of Toronto as an intellectual refugee. Another book I'd suggest is Ziblatt and Levitsky, How Democracies Die. And so what these scholars have done, they've tried to look at the process by which a democratic government slips into authoritarianism. And long ago, the cases people thought about were 1933, Weimar Germany, where the National Socialist Party was elected with a minority, and within 3 years it created a tyrannical dictatorship. And there are also cases of coups in South America. But there are cases that are now closer to home in our era. For instance, Turkey, Hungary, and of course the United States is well on that road. And this is a literature about national governments, but it can certainly apply to subnational governments, such as Ford's governments. With regard to the university sector, the Ford government has, I think, starved higher education through its tuition rollback and tuition freeze, and its near freeze on grants to the sector. In some sense, the sector has only been kept afloat with international students. When funding for the universities evaporates, the thing that disappears is research. And research is what a government is afraid of, because that's where the critiques come from. Your second question, what do I think are the most damaging things the Ford government has done? There are many, many things, but the ones I want to focus on are the things it's doing to tilt the playing field so it won't be defeated. And I'll mention 3. It ended the practice of a fixed mandate for majority governments. First in practice with this year's opportunistic election, and then they confirmed it with legislation. So there's no longer a fixed mandate. The second thing that they've done is they've removed any restrictions on government ads that obviously promote the party in power. So the government is spending a lot of money, a lot of taxpayer money, roughly $100 million a year for ads that promote the government. Those are the "it's happening here" ads that you've seen all over the place. These, I think, are egregious and problematic things the government has done.
Thank you so much, Mr. When you spoke about research, the first thing that came to mind for me is the Ontario government's decision to get rid of the Environmental Commissioner and move it under the Auditor General, where it has a lot less power. And lately, they've also separated the Auditor General from the Public Accounts Committee. They've basically limited how much power the Auditor General has. And it's the Auditor General's job to do research on the government, to hold them to account. Okay, the next speaker is Katrina Matheson. Katrina started organising Toronto District School Board parents, thank you Katrina, in the spring of 2023, beginning with a cold email to all school council chairs. Under the name Toronto Schools Caregiver Coalition, Katrina's group grew into an advocacy and change-making network uniting more than 1,000 parents, teachers and staff, and even a number of trustees throughout Ontario. And I believe we have a trustee here tonight, Deborah King. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much for your work. In April 2025, Katrina was elected to be the TDSB's Parent Involvement Advisory Committee member, co-representing Ward 10. And last month, the membership elected her co-chair of PIAC, that's the Parental Involvement Advisory Committee acronym, which is now one of the only remaining channels for parental impact on school board governance. Katrina, you're here to talk about what Doug Ford's done to schools.
Yeah, it's not good.
No.
So I guess where I would start is probably with the underfunding. Frankly, underfunding has been a problem. I think funding has been declining, not keeping up with inflation for honestly decades. I think people go back to the Mike Harris era and they really cite that as when it kind of started to decline. But it's really accelerated under Ford. And the thing that I'll say is really insidious about in terms of what he's doing to democracy is the fact that from what I saw as a parent, keeping a close eye on the trustees, was that there didn't seem to be any real communication between the trustees and the ministry. And that to me was shocking, to have the largest school board in Canada have no functional relationship with the minister was really shocking. And I saw them trying, and that was what initially when I started organizing, what we were trying to do was to get the trustees to make more of a statement to the ministry to say, look, this is a real problem. Because anyway, so I remember Rachel Chernos-Lynn, who was the chair at the time, sent a letter that was really detailed, outlined exactly how they were being underfunded. They weren't having funding for the basic things that they need to keep kids safe and educated and healthy at school. And the response, I remember it was like weeks and weeks and weeks went by without a response, and it got to be June and there was still no response, and the budget was due. And then finally a response came in, it wasn't made public, and it was like some sort of brush off kind of response. And it's I just don't understand how you can function as a government when you are literally not communicating. And clearly the TDSB was not the only board that was in that position. They weren't communicating with any of the trustees. So they're making the funding formula. They're like, oh, well, it adheres to the formula. But the formula, they're just pulling it out of thin air. It's it's not tied to the cost of things, and particularly in Toronto where things are more expensive. So anyway, that's a major problem. And then more recently, obviously the trustees have been dismissed. The school board has been taken over in Toronto, along with several other boards. So obviously that represents a sort of a crinkle in the democratic process, because you're sidelining the elected trustees, which is problematic. And then you're replacing it with this supervisor who is a consultant, not a public figure, right? And so he's sort of hiding a bit behind the apparatus, the institution. Parents have complained. They've made efforts to make his decisions more public and things like that. So there's not zero visibility, and we're still pushing for more and more. And we're making headway, but it is more challenging. They've also, TDSB used to have a number of committees, not just the Parent Involvement Advisory Committee. Those have been dismissed. I think we made it through along with SEAC because we have statutory protection under the Education Act. But everything that was sort of optional, they've gotten rid of. So what we're doing on PIAC, we've actually made it so that we can bring on some of those committees, so we can have a representative as a voting member on PIAC to represent those interests. So we're trying to make that kind of incremental change to really build up PIAC as to fill that gap. So that's what we're trying to do now.
Thank you. Just clarify, SEAC is
the Special Education Advisory Committee.
Thank you for your organizing. As a parent, it's really, really important that we speak up. I've tried to reach out to the supervisor.
Yeah.
He doesn't respond. He
Yeah.
doesn't respond. He's got no educational experience.
Yeah.
The next speaker is Binisekwe. She is an Anishinaabe matriarch and warrior a failed assimilated residential school survivor, a human sex traffic survivor as well. A grassroots advocate, she stands in solidarity with First Nations grassroots communities fighting for liberation, justice and the rights for all. She's also a part of a collective called Sisters in Solidarity Toronto that supports First Nations grassroots action and empowerment. She's also the owner of a small catering and residential moving business, and I believe you're a University Rosedale resident, so that's great. Venus, go ahead.
Yes.
You know, tell us a little bit about what you work on and how Premier Ford has impacted First Nations rights.
Hello. I'm Benisi and Mkikwe. Can you ask me that again?
Yes. Tell us what you're working on and how Doug Ford has impacted First Nations rights.
Okay, so who I am is I'm basically a warrior. I'm a matriarch. I run actually a peaceful assembly and ceremonial camp between Inukshuk Park and Trillium Park. So it's basically a land back camp for the resistance, for people to rescind Bill 5 and the detrimental impacts it has on First Nation sovereignty and inherent rights. And not only First Nation, Métis and Inuit people, but all people, which is the Green Belt, farmers, and so on. It's for our future generations, for your future generations. We've had this camp assembled now for going on 6 months. It's matriarch, grandmother, and youth, and warrior woman led. So we're there 24/7. We live in tents. We have an elders tent. We have teachings, and we speak to thousands of people since we've been there. We bring teachings on Indian governance, teachings on the 8th Fire Prophecy, and we write. We write a lot, and we're working on original ink to paper petitions, and that's who I am. And I also bring awareness to Every Child Matters, being an Indian residential school survivor myself.
Thank you, and Binisekwe.
Now the question.
I want to get to that second question. What impact has Doug Ford had on First Nations rights? And maybe you could speak a bit about Bill 5 in more detail.
Okay, so Bill 5, I don't know if you know about Attawapiskat, Grassy Narrows, and many other First Nation communities where the land is in degradation. Their hunting rights have been impeded on. In regards to mercury poisoning, their water rights and everything like that. Like, we have to boil water to bathe, or we get rashes from having a shower. Like, I'm not from Grassy Narrows or anything, I am an Anishinaabe, but in my own community we have a boil water advisory. These bills are very anti-Indigenous, and it is a systemic erasure of specifically First Nation people, the original land stewards and guardians. A lot of children have been sick, children and their parents and their grandparents and so on, from mercury poisoning and toxic waste that is spilled or put into their communities, into their water and into their lands. And also it is creating a big, furthermore, fragment between First Nation communities themselves, with the agents that work to the Imperial Crown, which are Chief and Council, and the grassroots people and people.
I thank you for being here.
And man camps. Man camps. With these bills comes mining and pipeline corporations, and I am a survivor of man camps. And that's anti-human trafficking. And that's a big problem. Murdered and missing Indigenous women, people.
Thank you for being here. Eric Gillespie practices civil litigation and administrative law. He graduated with distinction from Western Law and articled in part with the Canadian Environmental Law Association. He's appeared before all levels of Ontario courts as well as a wide variety of administrative tribunals. His firm has been recognised for its work as co-counsel on Pearson Smith versus Inco Limited, the largest certified environmental class action in Canada, and the G20 class action lawsuit. Thank you for that. More recently, his firm has represented Ontario Place Protectors in its ongoing legal challenge to the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act that is currently before the Supreme Court of Canada. Eric, thank you so much for being here. Tell us about what's going on from your perspective, and what are some of the worst things this government has done and why?
Sure. So thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Chris, and all your staff for organizing, and thank you, everybody, for coming out on kind of a chilly winter's evening. In terms of the impact on the sector we work in, which obviously is the legal sector, we were contacted a couple of years ago now by some very, very dedicated people that live here in our community, some of whom are with us this evening. And they had come together under that name, Ontario Place Protectors, otherwise known as the OPP. And they thought it might be a good idea for somebody to do something about what was going on at an Ontario Place on a legal challenge. So we've been involved in that for the last couple of years. OPP has been incredibly dedicated to seeing this through, and as Jessica just mentioned, we've worked our way through the Ontario court system, the Superior Court, the Ontario Court of Appeal, and we're now in front of the Supreme Court of Canada waiting for a leave to appeal decision that we understand from some communication in the last week or so will probably be made shortly. The effect of the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act 2023 is exactly what Chris said. It basically took away all of the rights for anybody to do anything about what is going on at that site through our court system, through our legal system. So the government can breach contracts, the government can ignore environmental legislation that took decades to create, they can ignore heritage legislation, they can commit acts of misfeasance and bad faith, and nobody can do anything about it anymore. That sounds like erosion of democratic principles to probably most of the people in this room at least. So OPP decided to challenge that, and that case has been moving forward. The good news is that OPP was able to establish the legal right for citizens to raise these issues, because the first court said, no, you can't even bring this up. You're not allowed to do that. And that was overturned, thankfully, by our Ontario Court of Appeal within the last 6 months or so. But the main issues are simply this. Courts have a role in our democracy, and they've been stripped of that role in OPP's view. As well, governments don't own land. You own it, and First Nations own it, and Indigenous peoples. And we own it, not the government of the day that comes and goes. So there is a doctrine of public trust that OPP says has been breached in this case. That's what the fight is about. But to answer the second question briefly, at this point, when it comes to where that damage is, Chris touched on this as well, and we've also heard about Bill 5. That was something that OPP said from the very beginning was going to happen. Because if you can take away everybody's rights related to one space called Ontario Place, then you could do it somewhere else. And that is exactly what has happened, as we've just heard, in many of our communities elsewhere in the province through Bill 5. And we were just chatting, getting ready for today. The federal government has now jumped on this bandwagon, and in the middle of a 600-page budget bill, there's 2 paragraphs that give every minister in the federal cabinet the same right to exempt themselves from the laws, just the same way that has happened at Ontario Place with Bill 5 and so on. So what's the damage? Incredible. And what can we do about it? I think that's maybe where we're going to be going next as a panel. So thank you.
You can see the trend here. Human rights, First Nations, schools, the legislature, municipalities, courts, universities. They're all being challenged and threatened with weakening of democratic processes. We can all see it. That's why we're here. The next question I'm going to ask each of you, I'm going to combine them just for the interest of time, okay? So the question I'm going to ask the panelists is, what does a restored and strengthened democracy in Ontario look like And what can we do? What steps can we take? Organising, protesting, you tell us. What steps can we take to help us push back? Okay, that's our two questions. I'm combining them just for time. Sanford, how about we start with you?
Okay.
So let's do 3 minutes here, okay?
Okay, well, what would a restored and strengthened democracy look like? Fair elections, more public consultation and legislative debate, a less dictatorial premier. We have a premier, we have a premier who thinks that he's mayor of Ontario and thinks that he's the chair of most of the school boards in the province. In a way, the premier is emulating President Trump, who thinks that he too is in charge of everything. I also wish that we had an alternative to first past the post in terms of how our legislature is elected. I would like to see a legislature elected by ranked ballot as opposed to first past the post. How do we achieve these things? I don't know. And I'll be honest. With regard to the legislature, that's very difficult, because obviously the Ford government will not under any circumstances depart from first past the post. And with roughly 40-45% of the electorate voting Conservative, it's very hard for the other parties or people who support the other parties to vote strategically in a way that can defeat the Conservatives. It may come to discussions among the leaders of the progressive parties in terms of some type of cooperation. I'll leave it at that. Of course, we're now waiting for one of those parties to elect a leader, and until that happens, such discussions can't happen. Okay.
Thank you for that answer. Katrina, actually, sorry, I'm just going to go, Eric, do you want to go next? So what does a restored and strengthened democracy in Ontario look like, and what can we do to get there? And I love it when people say, I don't know, because you have so much expertise on so much stuff. I love hearing I don't know, okay?
I don't know. Thank you, Jessica. And I think, these are obviously very complex questions. And if there were easy answers, we would get there much faster. But I think everybody in this room probably has been struggling with at least some of these questions, and we're not quite there yet. So it is fair to say, I don't know. That said, people in this room are actually doing something about it. And so in terms of what would it look like, it would look a lot like how this discussion started, with Chris saying, what are the fundamental principles? And noting that a lot of them are either being eliminated or eroded right now. So then to the second question, what can we do about it? The people in this room are actually the key, I believe, to this. The way the world changes is one step at a time, one vote at a time, one person at a time. And Margaret Mead made the comment, decades ago about the fact that the only change happens through small groups of committed citizens, and that's the way it's always been. So I think Churchill was the one who said democracy is the worst form of government except for every other form of government. So we're kind of stuck with the democratic principles. And then he also said, if you're going through hell, keep going. And at this point, that's not a bad suggestion. So here we're hearing some great ideas, and I'm sure Chris will touch on this, his bill that's coming up in our legislature, thankfully, for public discussion. So there are ways to do something about these problems. And there's all kinds of other things, and I'm sure other panelists will be talking, again, in their own areas about the things that they can do. But what we can do as a law firm is help people who are committed, like OPP has been, to carrying the legal fight forward. And I'll just finish by saying judicial review has been preserved. notwithstanding what I said earlier about all the changes that are very adverse to democratic rights, somehow the right to judicially review, which is something that happens through the legal process, that has been preserved. So we talk to people pretty much on a daily basis these days about how to preserve the rights they're concerned about through judicial review applications. And we're happy to talk to anybody and give our thoughts on what your options might be. But the last way to preserve it, I believe, is do what you're doing tonight, participate. Come and be part of the democratic process, and that includes voting. And I was around, probably many of the people in the room were around, when a lot changed at the federal level in 2011 when, God rest him, Jack Layton became the leader of the opposition. That happened at a grassroots level. That wasn't corporate Canada speaking, that wasn't big government speaking, that was us, that was the people speaking, and the world really changed. And the way the Ford government got to power was in a very dramatic fashion after a Liberal government. That changed again at the level we're at right here, right now, people. So I believe it's great to see people participating, and I'm really looking forward to hearing other people's thoughts on this.
Thank you, Eric. Mark?
Thanks, Jessica. So in terms of what would a better democracy look like, I can't say enough about MPP Glover's bill. It's a ray of light and hope in an otherwise dismal looking pattern of erosion of democracy. Not just for this particular government, but it's something for the ages to have an independent, objective, nonpartisan, funded Commissioner of Democratic Rights. If you haven't read all the information on it, he's got all the ways that can benefit society. So find a way to support him. Speaking of that, I have to say, picture of a better democracy would be to repeal the Strong Mayors Act and let your local councillors all have the same equal voice that they used to have if your jurisdiction has strong mayor powers. So what to do about it? So I probably people in this room, if you're here, you're probably more politically engaged, but people don't understand how much a positive effect it does have to send an email or a letter or a phone call to your elected representatives. People feel disempowered by a lot of the fighting they hear, and they find it dysfunctional, and they sort of turn it off. You probably tried to talk to other people, some of your friends and family, about politics, and I don't want to hear about it. So there might be a more gentle way of doing it, but at the dinner table. But back in the day, I remember as a teenager reading the paper, and Mitchell Sharp was the minister in Pierre Trudeau's cabinet, and he was justifying a piece of legislation. And back then, of course, there was no email. It said 3 out of 4 letters that he'd received were in support of this particular piece of legislation. When questioned further, it was actually 3 letters out of 4 letters. And that was supposed to be representative of what Canadians think, okay? So don't underestimate that, but here's one underutilized thing that maybe even people in this room are aware of the effect that you can have, is if there's something in the province that you're uncomfortable with, and you know that there's a grassroots group in your area who's also feeling the same way, you can go to your local council. If you find the Queen Park procedure somewhat intimidating, you can go to your local council and go as a delegation and encourage them to pass a resolution against a particular bill or in support of a particular bill, if you support it, or maybe aspects of that bill. And that can be passed around to all the other municipalities, and many of them will follow suit if it's well written and makes good sense. So on our website, restoredemocracyontario.ca, I just wanted to ask Lynn Crosby to stand up. She's co-chair, and she has put some materials on her website of how you can do that, how you can be a delegation, and how to approach your council. And I encourage you to consider that tactic, and I would encourage everybody in this room to do so, to go to their local council and ask them to pass a resolution in support of MPP Glover bill for Commissioner Democratic Reform. I think that would have a tremendous impact, particularly in the current environment that's been created with the number of acts that this government is doing. And I think you'll feel really good about it. So I would suggest everybody to consider that tactic.
Thank you, Mark. Finislikwe?
Okay. So I've kind of written mine down, because if I try and speak, I'm going to be all over the planet. So it says, if Ontarians feel democracy weakening, what practical organizing, legal or civic strategies are available to push back, and who needs to? Okay. So for me, my thoughts on this would be that all people, and not just agents to the crown, First Nation, Indigenous peoples, self-determination and community-led initiatives are most important. Look at the housing crisis, look at the housing, mental health and addictions crisis. For First Nations alone, on land they are gifted to. There is a need to build true, genuine alliances with First Nation grassroots movements. This will make a real change. And then other communities and organizations, so that all voices will be amplified in order to build democracy in a more meaningful, powerful way. Think and talk about natural law. We need to assemble peacefully, sit-ins, rallies, blockades, flash mobs, educate and learn together. Petition original ink to paper, because I'm not for those online petitions, because I think they just sit there. I don't know. Original to paper petitions. Talk about Canadian apartheid, anti-Indigenous tactics, anti-human tactics displayed by certain government corporations and entities. Raise true and genuine awareness. This Bill 5 doesn't only affect First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. This affects all of our future generations. Tighten up in regard to United Nations declaration, like UNDRIP, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's our duty, it's your duty to file complaints with the Human Rights Commission on provincial and federal levels, and it's their duty to uphold those complaints. Talk to the people who are passionate about democracy, First Nation, Indigenous rights, who are passionate about the land, air, water, and environment. People over profit. We need to work together as a real collective and reintegrate democracy in a good way. Land back means all land back, in community initiatives. In regard to First Nations, where our future generations don't have to beg for food and water and for a piece of land. Self-determination, where our inherent rights are respected and upheld, where our voices are heard and our views and ways of living bimatsuin, the good life, are centered in decision-making processes through and through. Real and genuine First Nation, Métis, and Inuit governance is respected. Implement truth and reconciliation, Commission's recommendations, including land and cultural restitution, which means land back. Language revitalization, cultural preservation, Indigenized knowledge, languages, and perspectives taught by Indigenous educators throughout all Ontario's so-called Canadian curriculum. Protecting our lands as the original land stewards and guardians who fend for the land, air, water, humanity without punishment. There's a couple of my friends that have been charged for being land defenders and water protectors, for fighting for you all, for all of us. Enact legislation, implementation of United Nations UNDRIP on the rights of First Nation Indigenous peoples, ensuring free, prior, and informed consent. Treaty agreements acknowledged and accounted for, especially in regard to the projects that impact First Nation lands and rights. Develop policies by First Nation Indigenous peoples, prioritize our rights and knowledge. Land back community initiatives, work with the people, not agents. Respect in a genuine, real way. Respect in a genuine, real way First Nation Indigenous people. Honor the treaties. Honor the land, air, water, environment, and honor humanity. People over profit. Let's start with land back resistance for the people. Thank you.
Katrina.
I'm really glad you wrote that. That was really excellent. Just to connect that to education, in 2020, UNICEF, which is the UN body that looks after the well-being of children, launched a campaign in Canada called Worlds Apart. And the message is that in Canada, the children, from one region to another, live worlds apart. And overall, our statistics are very poor. It was like, and this is dated, I don't know what it's doing now, but I remember seeing this campaign and thinking, wow, what is this? 1 in 3 kids in Canada isn't being properly educated, is functionally basically illiterate. And it's the rural communities in the north that are really, really hit hard by that kind of inequity, deep inequity. And the problem is that if we let that happen to one group of people, well, guess what? Over time, it's coming for us too. So, we have to really look at it as, co-liberation, right? We're all in it together. I'm sorry, I'm feeling emotional. So here we are, down the road, right? This has been going on obviously for, hundreds of years. So here we are, and now it's here, right? Now our kids are not scoring at grade level, and we're like, gosh, what's happening? This. We have to look back at our history and like kind of, what we think we can, what the people in charge think they can get away with, right? That's where this all comes from. Anyways, so. Here we are fighting for education. What was the question?
I'm sorry.
No, it was good. It was good.
So, what does a restoring strengthened democracy in Ontario look like, and how do we get
Yeah.
there?
Okay. I had written down things too. So I wrote down organized. So following on your point, Mark, organized, right? So yes, make the phone calls, show up, be there, do things. But it's easier if you have a group of people, and that was what when I started organizing parents, really I was just furious, and so I just was like trying to like get people on my side. But yeah, it's really helpful to do that, because then for example, what the parents do for education is they organize these phone zaps where it's like a Zoom call, and you've got a list of people to call, and you put yourself on mute, and you have your script up on the Zoom screen, and you all just make your calls, and you're doing it together, right? So it's just a lot easier to get through it. Just you have your WhatsApp group, and it's like, okay, today we're calling this person, today we're saying this, and it's just it just is much easier to do it when you have a group. So I would encourage you to reach out and find those groups. If anyone's interested in organizing, you can email me. My organizing email is torontosccoalition@gmail.com. The second thing I wanted to say is don't demonize. It's really easy to look at it and go, oh God, the Conservatives, and write them all off and say, we just can't talk to those people. And look, sometimes it might be true. Don't waste your breath, obviously, if it's just not working out. But a lot of times, people don't have a full understanding of what is happening, right? Or what exactly it means, or the difference between kind of a conservative political outlook versus eroding democracy, right? So sometimes you need to explain it, or you need to show them, or you need to find common ground with people that are good people, right? That just don't have the information that you have. I think it's maybe a little easier with education. It's maybe a little less polarizing because people want their kids to be able to read, no matter what group you come from. But in general, it's a good way to try and find common ground with people if you can. So I would say that's helpful to get, because the conservative people who voted for the folks who are causing the problems, they need to be able to make the calls too and say, hey, I voted for you and I think this is wrong. That's really impactful as well.
Thank you. Chris.
Okay, I'm going to take a slightly different tack. Everybody's struggling these days. So many people are struggling these days. Housing costs are outrageous. So many people are being pushed into homelessness. We have 80,000 people homeless. We have 1,400 encampments. 1 in 10 Ontarians is now using the food bank for food. We've got, young people, when you go to college or university in this generation, for the last 20 or so years, you end up with a debt that takes decades to pay back. So people are really struggling. And that struggle, the reason, that people are struggling is deliberate. And it's deliberate because if you're struggling to get by, if you're struggling to find a meal, or you're struggling to get housing, then you don't have the time to actually get active and fight for your democratic rights. And it's those democratic rights that allow you to fight for, lower tuition fees, for affordable housing, for, public health care, all of these things. And so we need to find a way to mobilize young people. And I think the most blatant example, one of the statistics I throw out is that there's 50% more wealth today in Ontario than there was 40 years ago. But over the last 40 years, the median income has been flatlined. So half of the people are earning less money than their parents did 40 years ago. And on top of that, they have to pay additional, much higher housing costs, much higher tuition fees, much higher food costs. So people are literally struggling. And so there's 50% more wealth. And the question is, where's all that wealth going if everybody's struggling so much? And it's all going to the 1%. The top 0.01%, their income has grown by 650% over the last 40 years. So there's this massive redistribution of wealth, and we're seeing it unfolding in the legislature these days. The last 2 months, we've been hammering the government, the Skills Development Fund. Okay, this is such blatant corruption, and it talks to an economy of circular economy of corruption. And the way it works is, somebody will give, like Doug Ford-Dennis will give the Conservative Party, $20,000 in donations. They use that money to help them get elected. In exchange, they get the dentist gets a $2 million Skills Development Fund grant to train his staff, with no strings attached, no documentation to show that anybody got trained or anybody got a job from this training. $100 million went to the clients of his campaign manager, of our tax dollars. So our tax dollars are going into this circular economy of corruption. And, okay, I think it just paused for a second. So we need to fight back. And we've been successful. When you're going through hell, you mentioned if you're going through hell, keep going. Okay, but we've also got to celebrate our successes. And I want to give, a couple of examples. We've been successful by mobilizing. When the government passed Bill 28 that stripped education workers of their fundamental rights and freedoms, and they were threatening to arrest any education worker who went on strike, all of the union leaders in the country descended on Toronto, and they said, this isn't happening. We will have a general strike if you don't repeal this bill. Within 3 days, they repealed that bill. So we can fight back. We need to mobilize. Bill 124, that's the one that illegally capped public sector wages at 1%. We fought back. We went to the Supreme Court, and Ford's threatened to use the notwithstanding clause on that. But he didn't because of the pushback, because he knew that there was going to be a massive pushback. The Greenbelt scandal. His friends bought all this farmland, in September, and then in October he passed legislation to remove the Greenbelt protections, and they stood to make $8 billion. Okay, and he had to backtrack on that. So we've had some successes. We've also had successes in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled last March that Ford violated our right to a democratic election in 2025 because he had passed legislation using the notwithstanding clause that made it illegal for third parties to put out paid advertising that was critical of the government 12 months before the election. So he was not only violating our right to free speech, he was also violating our right to a free and democratic election. And the right to free speech, he had overridden that with the notwithstanding clause, but he could not override our right to a free and democratic provincial election. And so the government's had to repeal that bill. We need to fight back. We need to fight back by mobilizing, and all of these, everybody here is mobilizing people. And we also need to fight back in the courts, and we need to support organizations like Ontario Place Protectors, because taking this government to court is not cheap, you know, and we need to make sure that they've got the support that they need to make, you know, to launch a successful campaign to repeal the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act and Bill 5. Final thing, I know I've gone on longer than I was supposed to, and Jessica's nodding at me. Okay. I've got a bill before the legislature on Wednesday to create a Commissioner of Democratic Rights. It would be a watchdog official in the legislature who's keeping an eye on any government, not just this government, any government ongoing, to make sure that our democratic rights are being protected for this generation, for future generations. The debate is on Wednesday. We've got some information that we've distributed. I hope you can come to the legislature to watch the debate on Wednesday. And
thank you so much, all of you, for the organising and work that you do in your various fields. I want to move to some of the questions that came in from people who RSVP'd, and if we have time, we'll take questions from the floor as well. So the first question, we're going to just do 1 minute, just 1 minute responses each, please, everybody. The first question is about voter apathy. So this person wrote in, talked about how this current government got in on 23% of votes from the electorate, because a lot of people just didn't vote. What can we do to inspire the electorate to engage in voting? This is a question. We'll start with Mark and then Chris. Sorry.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. So,
So 1 minute.
yeah, okay. So we strongly believe in the Independent Commissioner of Democratic Rights, significant step forward. Political parties tend to concentrate on their own base. The typical negative advertising during political campaigns tends to discourage voters. There needs to be somebody looking at the electorate as a whole. Maybe it's time we start listening to those who don't vote and find out why. And I think that would be one of the strong mandates of the Commissioner of Democratic Rights. Voting happens usually once every 4 years, but there's so much more engaged and interested citizens can do, or as I touched on earlier, just in part. If they're overwhelmed with what's going on in Queen's Park, there's other ways to contact the provincial government through their municipal government. I can't overestimate the power of that. So one of the most important things that we all know is that youth don't get out enough to vote. We're going to touch on social media later, but there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation that goes through social media. And it's really hard to cut through the truth. Again, this is another reason why I think an independent Commissioner of Democratic Rights will increase voter turnout and voter participation in between elections. I just want to say, do I still have more time in my minute? Okay, I got another point, but I'll add the next one.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, this is just going to be rapid fire, so I'm going to ask the next question that came in. This is about social media. And this question, I'm going to summarize. Essentially, for democracy to work, people have to be informed and educated. And what we're seeing with youth and their use of social media is that there's a lot of misinformation out there. Young people are getting a lot of misinformation, and it could be impacting how educated they are on the key issues and Canadian democracy overall. I want to give this question to Katrina, because Katrina actually knows a lot about this topic.
Yes. So I'm a PhD student also, and I do study technology. The problem with technology is it's really a double-edged sword. There are reasons why we really want an open and free sort of internet, but at the same time, there can be problematic aspects. This might be controversial, I don't know, but rather than just make a blanket statement like, oh, it's always good or it's always bad, I think going forward, I hope we can look to kind of like on a more granular level how the companies that run those sites are actually governing the sites as sort of a finer way to talk about what can be done to help our kids better better understand like what's being put in front of them, but also not be addicted to their screens. Like technical things, like for example, I mean, actually in China has done a lot to ensure that the kids are not addicted to the phones and stuff like that. So for example, on their TikTok, their version of TikTok, there's like a 5-second delay between every video. So, and it's like, it's enough to break that, just constant scroll. So stuff like that. But of course, the North American companies don't want to do that because it's problematic for their, profits. So, this is the tension. And actually, I know there's a lawsuit coming. I actually don't know much about the lawsuit, so I don't know, maybe Chris can talk about that. But anyway, so, hopefully over time we can make headway with that. But I think we need to have a very like specific conversation about actually how those sites are being run.
Thank you for that. Okay, next question. This is on public consultation. This is a question for Chris. Okay, so the government's been passing bills really quickly in the legislature, not letting them go to committee. Public cannot speak to them in committee. We cannot introduce amendments. Bills are getting passed in, 2 weeks sometimes. I've never seen this before, actually. In this government is bad. So the question is this: what concerns? Okay, given the government's use of time allocation to bypass public input, that's what they call it. Okay, for legislation like Bill 33, what can citizens do to force meaningful public consultation before these bills get finalized?
Okay, that's a really difficult question to answer because that's the strategy. The strategy is to attack everything at once: our public healthcare system, our public education system, our colleges and universities. Our colleges, had to lay off 10,000 staff this year, and they've cut 600 programs. Everything is under attack, and so and then they bring this legislation in. They meet very quickly. Like the House has only sat for 4 months in the last 12, and the reason they do that is they only bring in legislation that empowers the cabinet to make decisions without having to go back to the legislature. So, at the beginning I mentioned there's supposed to be in a democracy, a separation between the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. They're combining it all. Ford wants the power over everything. I think Mark was saying he wants to be the mayor of Ontario. He wants to be the chair of the school boards of Ontario. He wants to be the pundit who determines who is the judge and who is not a judge, because he only wants conservative judges. So he's breaking down that as well. And so the other thing he's doing is he's making the legislature, irrelevant by giving his ministers the power to make decisions without having to have a public vote and debate in the legislature. And the scary thing is that Carney's doing the same thing. In this budget that we just found out, there's an article in the Toronto Star, and I encourage people to look at it from the weekend. He has given his cabinet ministers the power to break any federal law except criminal laws, which is, it's an attack on all of our democratic rights. So we need to figure out a way, and I think what we do is we get together in groups like this, and we mobilize. And I think the hope for me is in seeing how many people came out. Like, I had no idea when we put this out. I thought maybe 30 people. We have 150 people who signed up for this tonight. And that, yes, give yourselves a round of applause. This is how we fight back, and this is only the beginning.
Thank you, Chris. This next question is for Benesquay. This question is about Bill 5. They want to know a little bit more about what Bill 5 is, so you can explain that. And also, what is Bill 5? It has a lack of Indigenous consultation. And what else, what does that demonstrate about the government ignoring treaty rights, sovereignty, and the duty to consult?
That's a lot.
I know. Tell us about Bill 5. How is it affecting the people that you work with and yourself?
I've been out in the snow, in the very cold, at the lake, under the elements, where I'm just getting over pneumonia. And I wanted to come here and speak. When Chris asked me to come, he wasn't sure if I should, but I said I could, and I wanted to, for not only for myself, for the people. And this Bill 5 is an Economy Act that is impeding on our sovereignty as humans. on land, air, water, and environment, where this is just a bill that is systemically erasing specifically First Nation people, my people, where it's having a detriment impact on my people, which are First Nation children and their families. You know, they don't have, you know, I guess, privilege like everybody else does to live as human beings on land that they are gifted to. This is what I see that Bill 5 as something to erase us, so that you will not have original land stewards and guardians to fend for our future generations, you know, to basically trample these agreements, these treaties that were made to the Imperial Crown. A lot of people don't realize that corporate Canada is a third party. It's the First Nation people that have the treaty to the Imperial Crown. And without these treaties, and these bills, it's allowing a biological warfare when it comes to First Nation children and their families, with all the poisoning and all the, you know, no consultation when it comes to mining and pipeline projects, you know, and what else? Sorry.
The impact of Bill 5, and then how does it, what does that say about the government's attitude towards Indigenous consultation and treaty rights?
Ford, I just think he's a very, for me, he's a very evil man. It's very deviant, and it's very anti-First Nation. Like with all the remarks he said in the media about First Nation. You can't be anti-Indigenous, racist, and hating on First Nations and apologize. You know, and saying that he's basically giving money to First Nation people when Canada has no money. It's First Nation people that have the money. So, land back. I don't know.
I'd like to open it up to the floor for questions. Yeah. Okay, so person in the grey sweatshirt over there. And we're just going to have to do it one at a time. So you can put your hands down, then you're going to have to raise them again, okay? So you don't have to keep your hands up for, 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to describe this quickly. I've got a couple maybe interrelated questions. So one is, I'm wondering what can be done to encourage municipal or provincial parties or leaders to make the issues and the specific examples we've all talked about tonight overt and explicit part of election campaigns, debates, to put them that much more into the public sphere. The existence of strong mayor powers, for example, does not actually necessitate their use, and that's something somebody campaigning for a mayorship could make part of their campaign. Maybe related to this, I think it's Mr. Warren's described a couple of books. One written by Snyder, for example, that talked about how these democratic processes and things get eroded. Did these authors offer any opinion or analysis of how those prior historical examples could have been avoided? If they have, that's what we need to do.
Wow. Okay, so Sanford 1 minute, and then Chris, do you want to go 1 minute after that with the next question?
All right. I was going to suggest taking all the questions.
Okay, yeah. How about we take a few?
So that
Sure.
see what people are thinking.
Yeah. Okay, I like that too. Thank you. Person with gray, yep, and the mask.
So much of what the PCs are doing, Ford is doing, they can do it because they have this false majority. And already we've had a mention, first past the post. If we have proportional representation, then he only had 43% of people, the vote, of people who voted, only 43. So we need to make that change, and that change can happen now because we've had 3 elections now where the Greens, the Liberals, and the NDP have been losing out. I mean, I feel so sorry for you guys having to deal with this situation because there's a majority vote. What can you do? The Liberals are going to be voting for a new leader, and I'm working with this is an NDP group, but I'm actually working within the Liberal Party to get them to be honest and serious about this one. And if we get a leader who's in favor of proportional representation, then talks to Merritt Stiles, I think we can make this happen. Now, with the majority right now, no, but we could have that little bit of cooperation somebody was mentioning, chisel the Conservatives down to minority, and then those, the Greens, Liberals, and NDP, they can bring this through. And it can happen in Ontario. So.
What should be our approach with regards to the easy use of the notwithstanding clause by governments? As you've mentioned, it's used in some cases, trivial cases, which put down movements in Toronto.
Okay, so these are great questions. I really like this idea of just keeping comments going because we can take these questions and we can respond after too. Anna, there was a grey hat. I know your name. I just mentioned that. And Best.
Good evening. My name is Bob Murphy. I'm a former outreach advocacy worker in York South-Weston, Ward 5. It's a mess all 3 levels of government. We're ghosted all the time. How do we tell our community members where we have all over such a small percentage of voters that go to the polls, how do we create hope? Because many of our community members have lost hope, especially with Ford and his friends running a wrecking ball through Ontario and running through our city.
If I talk to you tomorrow, I'll remember your name, but I don't remember your name right now.
My name is Don Young.
Thank you, Don.
And I actually have a question for Stanford. I mean, you specifically mentioned, ranked ballots. Ranked ballots, it has been described as first past the post.
Can you speak up?
Yeah.
I mean, who are you going to elect? The middle guy, you know, you're not going to vote for the left. The second choice is going to go to the liberals or the middle person in the group. And it's, you know, proportional representation is the way to go. It makes every vote, or almost every vote, count. Yeah. And that's what we should be looking for, not for ranked ballots.
Yeah.
Sally?
Hi. I just want to say that I appreciate this hugely because everything you've mentioned I sort of heard before, but it's really, really come to life for me. I wish that we could have, somebody would put these on in more parts of the province where they're really Tory. They really always vote. You know, I can name you can all name parts of the province. It seems to me this would be not too hard to find a couple of MPP people from neighboring ridings and put together this thing. And then everybody just go out and every time your friend says anything about Trump, says, whoa, wait a minute, I just want to tell you a bit about Ford. So just don't listen to anything about Trump. Tell them one of the details you've heard tonight.
Thank you. And my request is just everyone try and speak up because we've got people in the back. Yes?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if you guys have, or on the panel, if you have a kind of a historical perspective on this that gives some hope. We've got some fundamental issues here. The idea that municipalities are creatures of the province has been present. It's in the legal system. It's there. We've never had municipalities with any power at all once the provincial government decides to take it away. The tradition of voting, thinking that having a Tory government is the same as having weather, it's good or bad or whatever, but that's the government. I remember that from Leslie Frost, I remember with Bill Davis, I remember that coming on. It's been there for a long, long time. I remember speaking when I was a campaign manager when I was 19 years old. I was too young to vote. At that time, you couldn't vote until you were 21. But in the campaign in Huron-Bruce, a little bit like McNabb Brayside, the same kind of atmosphere. When the federal election, when we had the nomination meeting and things went up, I just spoke a little bit about my experience in the civil rights movement in the southern United States, where I had been taking you up from a student.
Do you have a question?
And yeah, my question is, what happened was that, and I just said, we don't have democracy like that, what's going on there, where people are moving, where there's a whole sense of participation. We haven't had that here, ever. Now I think there's more of it, and that's my question. Is, do you have a sense that there is more activity, that there are more vehicles, and not so much a sense of just the government's the government, you got to put up with it because it's not going to change?
One of the panelists mentioned that you'd love to see ranked ballots elect a legislature. Are you aware that there's a charter challenge now, specifically about taking the first past the post voting system to court? And the fact that they've sent in an application for leave to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, because Ford and the Ontario government, they've been chopping our rights away for the last 7 years through the courts. And I personally feel that's the way we have to go. To reclaim our democratic rights, we have to do it through the courts, because the politicians are not going to do it for us. So are you aware of the charter challenge that's happening right now?
Okay, because it's 8:29 and we're going to do closing remarks, I'm sorry. This is an important topic and we care about it, but we're all going to be here in the room. We can talk to people after, including the panelists. Let's just give the panelists a round of applause. I follow this issue every day, and I was struck by the commonality that I heard when it came to the dismantling of democratic norms in all these sectors. I personally was struck. I really was. A few things. It also gives me hope, because each of the people here, and I know many of you in the room, are already active in challenging democracy, standing up for human rights. You're examples of what we should do and what we should motivate other people to do. I also heard a lot of very practical things that we can take as individuals or as a group. Support legal strategies, vote, have tough conversations with conservatives, talk about democratic issues in ridings that are held by conservatives. Talk to the Liberals and the Greens. We get it. We hear that a lot. I'm hearing a lot of very practical things that you can do, and we'll be sharing these in the notes that come after. And then the final point I want to make before I hand it over to Chris is that the government is really good at attacking one sector at a time or one group at a time. This day it's school boards, the next day it's student unions. We didn't even talk about that tonight, but they're targeting student unions. The next day it's appointing, meddling in how judges are appointed. The next day it's, banning Kingston from choosing how they want to vote when they brought in ranked ballots. But what I like about tonight is that we, as a community, came together and said, actually, we're united in a lot of issues, and in order for us to address these issues, we need to work together. I see a huge value in building alliances across different sectors, from parents to municipalities, to lawyers, to academics, to First Nations, to stand up and say, hey, we actually give a damn about democracy and we're going to do something about it. That's what we're doing here tonight. Thank you so much for coming.
And I'm going to just answer one of the questions, and that was, where do you find hope? And I find hope in this room. I find hope in that 150 people signed up, to come out here tonight to talk, to talk about democratic rights in this province. And the other place I find hope is in connecting the young people, particularly young people who are struggling in this province, to helping them to understand that the reason they're struggling is because democratic rights and economic rights are intertwined. If you don't have democratic rights, you don't have economic rights. You don't have the right, to a decent living, to work in a safe workplace. Union rights. The unions are democratically run. And that was how we fought for the middle class. And going back to your question, like historically, my father was born in 1932. And he grew up through the Great Depression, he grew up through the Second World War. And the soldiers who came back from the Second World War, they'd been through the Depression, they'd been through the war, they said, we're not going to take this crap anymore. We're not going to work for nothing. We're not going to let, a bunch of people play on the stock market and launch us into another 10-year depression. We're going to actually seize control. We're going to form unions. We're going to, take control of the government. We're going to demand workers' compensation. We're going to demand employment insurance, public health care. We want to expand our public colleges and universities so everybody gets those opportunities. That's how we got to where we were, And now the government, the people in power are trying to erode all those gains that we made after the second, in the post-war period. So we need to get them back. We need to find the energy that the soldiers coming back from the Second World War found, to mobilize people and to unite people, because we have the power. Like, I know that sounds, but we are, the people are the ones with the power. We still have our democracy. We still can vote these guys out. And we need to do that. We need to make sure that we do that in the next election. And then we need to vote in a government, and whatever shape the government takes, it has to be one that's committed to, economic justice, to restoring our democratic rights, and to, making sure that we have those democratic rights ongoing. And part of that is, through proportional representation. So I find great hope in all of you being here. And this is not, as Jessica said, it's not the end of the session. It's the beginning of this conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also follow us on social media, and for more information, check out our website.